Actually, let me press the button now. um, for those people who cannot make today's meeting, all participants have been muted to reduce the background noise. If you have a question during the presentation, please use the chat box. We will open up the forum for verbal questions at the end of the meeting. I'll also go through the process on how to raise your hand and such so we can have an orderly question period. So if all participants can also go through and rename yourself and put in your agency if you have not done so already. That is all I have for now. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Kristen. Dr. Poland, would you like to start your presentation?
Excellent, thank you. I appreciate the introduction. Hopefully everyone can hear me fine and see the slides. There's a ton of information in these slides, and I just want to make everyone aware that I've provided a PDF copy to the COG for distribution. I'm going to move through a lot of slides pretty quickly, only touching on a very small portion of the information on them. Please try and not get frustrated with all the information, and I will keep you focused in on what I'm specifically speaking to. So the aim of this is to kind of explore affordable housing by the numbers. We're going to look at urban economics, location, land value. We're going to translate income into affordability. I think this is very important, and I'll talk more about it later. And the differences between in affordability between owner-occupied and renter-occupied. I'm going to focus primarily on renter-occupied, but I'll talk a little bit about owner. And then also there's a heavy focus here on 8-30G, since it's always front and center in the context of land use and planning in Connecticut. I want to provide some background here in that this presentation was actually developed back in December and January, pre-recent events. It hasn't been developed based on this elevated interest in socioeconomic racial segregation and the role that housing and affordable housing plays in it. With that said, I want to make some things clear. The initial background of this was kind of an exercise in working through the financial feasibility of affordable housing, specifically the challenges and limitations of 8-30G. I also want to make clear, I am firm in my convictions that government, specifically society, we are government for the people, by the people, has a role in providing a social safety net. This includes housing and housing affordability. Income and racial disparities are real. Nationwide, African-American households earn $41,000 median household income, and white households $70,000. We need to be clear on that, because ultimately income translates into housing. So socioeconomic and racial segregation are also real, especially in the context of housing and especially in the context of zoning. Zoning in and of itself is simply a tool. It can be used for good, and it can also be used for bad intent. Also, there are unintended consequences in what we do in zoning. Zoning is exclusionary. If you think about it, the basic premise of it is dividing up land into specific uses and excluding certain uses from those areas. In the context of housing and affordability, we need to look towards making zoning inclusionary. So with that as the foundation, I'll now move into the presentation. First, I want to start off with kind of a look at urban economics. I don't really differentiate between what is city and what is suburban. That is, I believe we exist within metropolitan regions. And when we look at the metropolitan scale, and when I use words like city, I'm really speaking about metropolitan, we see some naturally occurring kind of organization to the structure of metro regions. So this slide here gets at kind of this basic structure. Density is typically highest at the center, the core of a metropolitan region, and it declines with distance from the center out to the periphery. At the same time, we typically also find that as income increases, land consumption and floor area increase. And when we put those together into housing and land use, we see this similar pattern. Now, there are exceptions to these rules. Fairfield County is kind of a complex region in that you have your own individual core cities like Danbury, Bridgeport, and Stamford that have their historical natural suburbs. But at the same time, the county as itself, the region as itself, functions as a suburban realm to the New York metropolitan region. So there's these overlapping centers and peripheries that are occurring. But if we use the Hartford regions as an example, because it's more definable maybe in this context, and we look at the cost of housing at the core and the cost of housing at the periphery, we can start seeing how kind of this idea of land value and distance translate and relate. So essentially, land rent is highest near the center and lowest near the periphery. A household at a given income can access larger housing and more land area further from the center. Housing costs essentially adjust for location, which is essentially accessibility, which I'll discuss on the next slide. So using my own home as an example, we purchased our home in Stafford Springs, Connecticut, which is exactly a half hour with no traffic from downtown Hartford. The purchase price was $136 a square foot. Doing a look on MLS at comparable properties, specifically size of home, number of bedrooms, number of bathrooms, number of garages, and we find in South Windsor, kind of a second tier suburban community, $175 a square foot. And then in West Hartford, a core suburban community, we find $195 a square foot. You can see this direct translation between distance from the core and value. Why is this? Ultimately, it's because cities and metropolitan regions are labor markets. And it's really about accessibility to employment opportunities. That is, someone located in the core, and if we look at kind of commute times as being a maximum of an hour in Connecticut, commonly between 20 and 40 minutes, then the fact is someone centrally located has access to the entire region. That's this diagram over here. And someone at the periphery of the region only has access to a portion of the jobs within the job market. So spatial location, access to transportation, whichever mode of transportation that may be, become extremely critical in kind of the distribution of land value and housing costs. Now, there are other factors that play in. So this slide here basically looks at this idea of the spatial temporal context of housing as a commodity. We often talk about housing in the context of space, that once again, distance from the core, and as you move outwards in distance from the center, you typically see lots and houses increasing in size. But there's also a time context here, that what was the ideal consumer product, say in 1950 for a home versus what is that product today? We see that housing and lot sizes have also changed over time. So for example, my parents' home in Wethersfield, a suburb of Hartford, constructed in 1956, is a quarter-acre lot with a 1,000 square foot, 3-bedroom, 1-bath house. Move over time, and the most common property kind of being built today is probably around 2,500 square feet. It's 4 bedrooms, 2.5 bathrooms. It has to be an ensuite bathroom with the master because we don't want to socialize with our kids in the bathroom, and so forth and so on. And the number of garages have increased from 1 to 2 to sometimes 3 or even more. So we see that housing and lot size have changed and increased over time. And also it's more common to find the larger housing towards the periphery rather than towards the core. Defining affordable housing and affordable housing need. First and foremost, 8-30G, from my perspective, provides a narrow definition of affordable housing. And I know many of you will probably agree with that. So they define assisted housing and they define set-aside housing as that which qualifies based on deed restrictions and level of affordability. The reason why I say it's narrow is it only considers housing units receiving government assistance specified programs and deed restrictions. It does not include market rate housing that sells or rents at values affordable to low and moderate incomes. Nor does it consider kind of supply and demand for housing. Where is the greatest need for housing affordability? At what price points? At what locations? So there is a narrowness to this. And it's understandable in the context of policy not always being that specific, but more generalized. Generally, HUD sets forth this idea that if you pay more than 30% of your household income on housing, then housing is unaffordable. That's pretty much agreed on across the industry. It's how you define household income that becomes challenging. For example, CHFA uses median family income, while 8-30G uses median household income. And those are actually and can be very different numbers. And there's other programs that define it differently. We also then draw into it kind of this idea of, is it a 1-person household or a 4-person household or an 8-person, and income adjusts accordingly. But generally, for example, in the Hartford metropolitan area, median family income is $96,000. In Fairfield County, median family income is $138,000. Different segments of Fairfield County vary though. You guys kind of have a range on median family income from about $102,000 to $144,000, depending on where in the county. Whoop. Sorry, I didn't mean to switch that slide. So there does become this level of complexity in how we actually define it. But the 30% threshold, spending more than, means that how a household can spend to purchase housing, the percent of income spent on housing, whether it's purchase or for rent, no more than 30%. I do want to be clear, actually I'm going to skip over that. Well, I want to be clear in this idea that sometimes you hear 2-bedroom, the median value of a 2-bedroom apartment put out there as affordability metric. And I think that's a poor metric to use because at the end of the day, not all renters actually need a 2-bedroom household housing unit. And the fact is, in Connecticut, 40.5% of renters are 1-person households. And therefore, it shows this kind of that the 2-bedroom apartment median value may not be the best metric for measuring affordability. And we'll get more into that as I go further into this. So there's 2 ways basically here that we can calculate affordability. If we're talking about purchase value, it's usually about 3 times gross household income. So if you make $75,000 a year, you can afford about a $225,000 house. Now we can adjust that metric down to about 2.6 to account for kind of utility costs and so forth, but somewhere between that 2.6 and 3 times gross household income. For rental, we often use that percent of income, and we can use the percent of income on housing costs of ownership. I'm just differentiating here for simplicity. But when a household can't afford to spend on housing, 30% of household income, housing is unaffordable then to households spending more than that. And the higher you get, 40%, 50%, the more burdensome it becomes. So for example, a household earning $75,000 per year is spending more than, if they are spending more than $22,500 a year or $1,875 per month, then housing is deemed unaffordable. And that provides our metric for kind of measuring affordability and cost of housing within the marketplace. From my perspective, basically, if we look at housing affordability, it is really a problem of one of 2 things. Either the income of a household is too low to afford housing, or the cost of housing is too expensive for the household to access affordable housing. And I think this varies from location and varies in regions. In a hot market like a Boston or a San Francisco, or maybe even in New York City, at the end of the day, the problem of affordability is probably more related to housing costs, that the cost of housing has gone through the roof, that even for a higher income household, it may be challenging to access the housing market. I think in Connecticut, Definitely the 7 counties, less Fairfield County, and I think also possibly Fairfield County. It's more of a problem of income, that there's households that earn too little to afford the housing within the marketplace. And I'll get to that when I look at some additional numbers. So at the end of the day, there really ends up being 2 solutions: raise income, that's increase wages, right? Or lower housing costs, reduce housing cost constraints. Uh, that's in the simplest form. There's other ways, but I want to boil it down to kind of these simple metrics. Also, we have to recognize that just because a household is spending more than 30% of their income on housing, it may not be because of an affordability issue. So for households of means, I would say at or above the median household income, if they're spending more than 30%, they can afford cheaper housing within the market. Therefore, they may be actually making a personal choice to actually be spending more. And what that means is things like status, lifestyle, location, access to opportunities, or access to education. So not everyone spending more than 30% is challenged by affordability, but we'll see how that plays out in income in a later section. When we talk about housing affordability and income, there's often this abstractness that I think comes into, especially 8-30G and land use, that this idea that 80% AMI is affordable, or 60% AMI is affordable. But what does that mean actually in terms of value, in terms of income? So this slide focused on the Hartford market, and I will translate some numbers for the Fairfield County market, takes a look at what is 100% AMI for household income based on size. And I just use 1 through 4, not a lot of 8-family households in this day and age. But we can see at 80% AMI or 100% AMI, a 1-person household, 67,000. In Fairfield County, that would be around 102,000, I believe. Or no, I'm sorry, don't quote me on that. I'm not sure on that number specifically. But a 4-person household would be 100% AMI is 96 and 80% AMI is 77,000. The next slide, the next chart down here then translates that to the percent of income, 30%. So this would be the top end of 80% AMI is 23,000, and then 16,000 for the 1 person. Moving over here, we now divide these numbers on the left-hand chart by 12 months, and that gives us the monthly income that a person can afford to spend on housing. I put this in context here with just providing wages at 80% at the various AMIs, specifically 80% AMI for a 2-person household is $31, and for a 1-person household is $27 an hour. Minimum wage in Connecticut is $11 per hour. That works out to approximately $22,000 per year, and it's going to go up to $12 an hour this fall. So income and rent by the numbers. So this is dealing with rental properties. And as we have that table again here, 30% household income works out to $1,900 a month or $1,300 a month or something in between there. For the rental market, we really need to divide it into 2 segments. That is newly constructed rentals and existing rentals, because what we find is there's a tremendous difference in value or cost of housing, whether it's newly constructed or existing. So moving down here through the narrative, existing housing units, this is based on census data for the Hartford region, rents from $500 or less to $3,000 per less per month, and median rent is $1,044. Only 13.9% of rents are above $1,500 a month, which is approximately 80% AMI for a two-person household. That's actually quite reasonable. Only 2.9% of rents are above $2,000 per month. And then 45% of rents are below 1,000. When we just look at these raw numbers, or what is approximately 60% AMI, we kind of start to realize that, hey, maybe there's not really an affordability issue here. But if we look at new construction, rentals range, studios, if we go up here, in the Hartford market, new construction today is around $1,265 for a studio, all the way up to about $2,450 for a 3-bedroom. We now start seeing that new construction is topping out above this median rent value of existing housing and is topping out above where the majority of the housing market, existing housing stock is within the marketplace. So that becomes important in the context of if we're thinking about policy and trying to provide affordable housing, building new affordable housing is actually the most expensive route to go. So market rents of newly constructed are not affordable at 60 and 80% AMI, generally. We'll see some specifics when we get to that. Then in the context of 8-30G, we have to include utility costs. And when we bring utility costs into it, we start to see that we reduce the income available for rent. So if I just go back to this slide, $1,300 a month for a one-person household. But when we pull in factoring in the cost of utilities, we drive that number down at 80% AMI, and I'll get more at this later on. So there is something interesting here in that not only does affordable housing, qualifications for affordable housing require these income limits, 60 or 80% AMI, we then also require to account for utilities in that, which shifts a cost ultimately to the developer beyond just the rental subsidy, but the cost of utilities subsidy. Ownership, I'm just going to touch on very quickly because I think today, the market, since the crash of the market in 2008 to 2010, the majority of what's been being built out there, the demand has been more in the rental market. The ability to address housing affordability and the need is greater in the rental market. So just let me touch on this very quickly. In Hartford County, median income owner-occupied home is valued at $235,000. You need a median household income of $78,000 to access that typical house. So 38% of owner-occupied housing units are valued at less than $200,000. So there is some affordability there. 31% or 32% are valued between $200,000 and $300,000. At the end of the day, the market is actually, the home ownership market is actually serving median household income and above pretty well. So I'll leave it there. Estimating affordable housing need. So let's just look at some big picture numbers here and see how this plays out, and then I'll look at some specifics. In Connecticut, there's 475,000 households that earn less than $50,000 a year. That's between 50 and 60% AMI, depending on household size. In Hartford County, there's 129,000 earning below $50,000 a year. Department of Housing says that there's 168 qualified units statewide. So about 35% of those 475,000 households earning less than $50,000 can be accounted for in the qualified housing, but there's 600,000 households not being served. If we generally translate that into the Hartford region, there's about 160,000 households with monthly costs of $1,250 or less, and 129 households 29,000 households earning 50,000 or less. The basic calculation here, you have 160,000 units and you have 129,000 households. Supply is actually outpacing demand. There's not actually, at this metric, at this point, it doesn't look like there's a housing affordability issue. But it's when we then look at households below $25,000 per year, and this is approximately the poverty level. There's 44,000 renter households, but there's only 22,000 renter units paying less than 30% of their monthly income on rent. So demand for low-income affordable housing is double that of supply in this metric. So essentially, the greatest housing affordability need is at the lowest income levels. We have to put that in context of remembering when we're talking less than 50% AMI, and definitely when we're talking 25% or less of AMI, those are very different income numbers in demand for affordable housing than the 60 and 80% that's associated with 8-30G. And this plays out then just a basic table from the US Census for Harford County provides us with this breakdown of households earning less than 20,000, between 20 and 35, 35 and 50, and occupied units, owner-occupied units, and then rental units. And let's go over to the rentals. For households earning less than $20,000 per year at or below poverty, essentially 21% of households are spending more than 30% of their income. At the next income cohort, up to 35,000, it's 15.1, and at 50,000, it's 7.75%. Look what happens when we then hit the 50 to 75, and then when we hit 75 and over, and if we just say basically on the numbers we already saw, 75,000 is about 80% AMI. The fact is, at or above about probably $65,000 in income, the housing market is functioning without a significant affordability issue. Is there still a need? Yes, but it's small. The greatest need is down here. The fact is 44% of renters with incomes less than 50,000 spend more than 30% of their income on housing. And 16% of owner-occupied households spend more than 30% with incomes less than $50,000 per year. That means at the end of the day, we can see housing affordability is much more a rental issue than a home ownership issue, and it is much more a 50% AMI and lower issue than it is a higher AMI issue. It also brings into that initial point I made, is it a problem of housing income, or is it a problem of housing costs? And the problem of housing affordability is more in Connecticut a problem of low income than it is a problem of housing costs. It's that households don't earn enough to actually afford decent, safe, quality, and affordable housing. Demographics are key, and we typically don't pay attention to these, and I just want to highlight them, how important they are in the context of understanding housing markets. In 1970, 40% of households were married couples with children. By 2012, that dropped to 19.6. Today, it's about 17.6. This is a dramatic change in household characteristics and the housing stock that currently exists. This relates directly to declines in fertility rates and the fact that we just have fewer children than we previously did. Other social cultural things such as we marry later, we marry less, non-traditional households, so forth and so on. You can see married couples without children has stayed stable over time, while other family households, men living alone, women living alone, and other non-family households have increased over time. So about this change in household structure. demographics become important in understanding the housing market. Fertility rates and household size have been in decline for decades and continue to drop. The percent of households, as I just said, with children has dropped tremendously. If you think housing is driving your education costs, you're most likely wrong. The fact is, it's other things that are worked into that. We have so fewer children than we previously had before. So then in the US today, 28% of households are single person households. In 1960, only 13% were single person households. More important, when we look at who are these households and this change in kind of household dynamics, children living only with their mother increased from 1960 at 8% to 23% today. Only with father from 1% per 4%. So think about that. When we oppose affordable housing, what we're really opposing is actually single mothers with children. You really need to think about that because that's the majority of who this greatest need for affordable housing market actually is. So most of the housing stock, especially single family detached, was built to serve the needs of traditional families of the past, not the smaller non-traditional households. Just go back to 2000. If I said it's at 17.6 today, and in 2000 it was 24%, so that's what? That's a 7% decline just over 20 years on the households most needing the larger single family detached. If you think about why single family detached values have been depressed in a place like Fairfield County in recent times, and why the higher end, larger house end of the market has been harmed the most, it's this change in demographic structure that's actually driving it. So let's look at Connecticut and then Harford County. 40% of renters are single person households. Two-person households make up 37% of owner occupied. In Harford County, 37% just shy of, and 41.2%. Our demographic structure, our household structure has changed as such that the need and demand for housing or kinds of housing have actually changed. This is that shift towards the apartment rental and the move away from the single family detached, and especially the softening of the higher end of the single family detached. Hypothetical 8-30G here. I just want to show you how the 80% AMI and 60% AMI impact the financial feasibility of such a development. So basic thing, 400 units here. This is a rental apartment. We have 280 market rate, 30% affordables, 120, evenly split between 60%, 80 and 60% AMI. And then this is a breakdown of units, studios, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, and the split of the market rate versus the AMI. So when we go in here, and I'm just going to point you to key numbers here. First, let's look at this idea of what are market rate rents, right? And what are 100% AMI rents. I want you to notice that in the studio and 1 bedroom units, that market rate actually runs less than 100% AMI. That means market rate is actually running around somewhere in the 90% AMI, not at 100%. I think that's important in the context of understanding affordability. And when we look at 80% AMI for a studio or a 1 bedroom, they actually track really well with market rates. So if you think that an 80% AMI 1 bedroom apartment is attracting a low income household, they're actually not. They're attracting the middle market. They're attracting what market rate actually is. I break these down by per square foot also because I'll talk about those later. As we move up into 2 and 3 bedrooms, you then start to see that the market rate starts trending higher than the 80% AMI and still trending lower and then almost exact with the 100% AMI. Move on to this table, and now we adjust for utilities, right? That adjustment for the percent of income being used towards utilities for the AMI, for the cost of housing. And what we see here when we pull utilities into it, that what is actually affordable decreases further, right? So compared to down here, 80% AMI was 1352 on the studio, or 1352 or 1546 on the one bedroom. And up here, we see it come down to 1253. That's using a one person household. That's why the number is the same on both. So ultimately, the drawing in utility costs actually drives the amount of income available for rent itself. Look at that in the sense of cost per square foot. In general, what we find doing market research in the Hartford region, for a project to be financially viable, rents have to be at about $2 a square foot per month. When they're less, then it becomes unviable. The lower it goes below 2, the more likely it's not financially viable. The higher, the better. Look what happens here. So without adjusting for utility costs, the one bedroom rent is at above $2 a square foot. When you pull in utilities, it drops well below. Hopefully you can start to see how this affordability is starting to impact kind of the financial viability. So I did these effective rents, and this is the studios, the one bedrooms, 2 and 3, and then effective rents at 60% AMI, 80% AMI. The market rate, which is what we'd be striving for, are these at or above, and so forth. But I want to bring you over here. These are essentially the reduced revenues per unit and the losses per year on the affordable units in this development. 400 unit development with 120 affordable units will lose about nearly $500,000 a year in income based on those affordable rents, or that's 8 to 10% of total operating income. Knowing many of you are, chief executive officers of your municipalities, think if tomorrow you were told that we were taking away 10% of your revenue and you still had to operate, and there was no alternative way to raise additional revenue, and the majority of your operation costs were tied to debt, right? So 8% hit on operating income is actually huge in the context of whether or not a development's financially feasible. I think this is key as to why 8-30G hasn't produced the number of units that we hoped it would produce over time. The fact is the affordability levels make it really challenging to pencil low. So this is one of my favorite tables here because the adjustment. So this is the rents by unit type based on square footage, right? These were the market square footages that I was using for the Hartford region. This is the minimum rent required for a 550 square foot studio, right? And this is the 80% AMI. We actually see 80% AMI trending higher than the required. That works, financially feasible, and it's actually trending higher than market rate. Market rate here is 1,600, 80% AMI is right in there. It's not that unaffordable. And once again, trending higher than the required rent to make this development be financially feasible. This is the thing though, so many of us in our zoning, so many communities have provisions that say two things. One, minimum unit size, that if you're gonna build XYZ unit, a one bedroom or a two bedroom, it has to be a minimum square footage, right? Another thing our regs often say is that on affordable housing 8-30G developments, the affordable units have to be the same as market rate units, right? That's where this starts falling apart. Because now in this table, I reduce the unit size by, I go from 550 to 450, from 725 to 650. All these numbers, the cost per square foot in construction stay the same. Run this out over the total cost per unit, and then ultimately the 8-year return that's required. And what we see is a dramatic drop in the required rent just by reducing the square footage. And if we go over here then to what is 80% AMI compared to the required rent, we all of a sudden see housing that's becoming more affordable, more financially viable, right? And trending higher than market rate rent. If we drop the square footage, we can actually make this development work much better. So why are we imposing our middle class standard of living on lower income households? We're saying they have to live in a 1,300 square foot, 3-bedroom apartment. I grew up in a 1,000 square foot, 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom, 1-car garage, single family house in the 1970s and 80s. It's perfectly fine at 1,000 square feet. So those minimum requirements we put in place actually drive up the cost of housing. If we let, just to say, and I know this is hard for people to understand, but if we just let the market build what it could or wanted to, we could see a lot more affordability, but we constrain it by setting minimums. Same thing here with home ownership. In the interest of time, because I want to leave time for Q&A, I'm going to skip over this, but same calculations here. And once again, I do this by square footage. It's the same development at different square footages and then adjusted for the various factors here, right? And when we go down in square footage, if we could build the 1,500 square foot house again, it would be a lot more affordable. While it still doesn't necessarily pencil out, it's a lot more affordable than if we didn't, if we required everything to be a 2,500 square foot house. Spatial organization of affordable housing. So once again, I want to return you to this graphic from earlier on, but here on the right-hand side, the last place, I did the contraction essentially in household size. If we decreased household size and we decrease lot size, we would actually increase affordability. So back to the spatial organization. There becomes this challenge here. It could be very easy to say, well, all affordable housing should be located in the core because it provides the greatest access to job opportunity. And I agree with that to a degree. The problem is, as history has shown us, our clustering of affordable housing in low-income households into core areas has created vast numbers of socioeconomic ills. At the same point in time, the fair share approach of, say, the 10% requirement of 8-30G, that every community must have an equal or fair share, is also unrealistic. Putting that 25% AMI or less household out in the periphery with no access, if they're at or below poverty, with no access to public transportation, economically isolates them from the job market. So they can't access the job market. So we have two things kind of forcing up against each other here. This ideal of providing access to the labor market or the job market, but at the same time not clustering populations into a given area. Just for the record, this does not forgive communities of their responsibility to provide affordable housing, but exposes the failings of one-size-fits-all policy. I'm not saying because you're wealthy and at the periphery, and because poor people would be isolated, they shouldn't be allowed in your community. What I am saying is that if I go back here, you should really pay attention to the fact that 80% AMI is middle income housing. You're not dealing with low income housing whatsoever. You should be happy to actually have 80% AMI housing in your community. It would provide housing for your workforce. So let's look at the affordable housing appeals list. This is basically green is communities with greater than 10%, 5 to 10% qualified is the blue, and then the yellow is unqualified. This map is dramatic in some ways, and I just want to point out a few things here. One is it's evident that, Fairfield County has a greater affordability challenge than maybe Harford County. But it also kind of brings out that emphasis of what I was just talking about. The fact is we don't want to put, 25% AMI households up in Salisbury, Litchfield County, and isolate them from access of job market. We also don't want to continue to cluster 40 and 50% or 30% poverty in our core cities. We have to find a way to balance this. We also have to recognize that there are land constraints here, as I'm sure you all know. Things like lack of public water and lack of public sewer make it very difficult to, build higher density, more affordable housing in places like, say, a Kent or so forth. Not an excuse, but we have to recognize the challenge. This is more interesting to me. In the context of economic development, I always and have for over a decade, almost 2 decades now, been talking about the need to reduce conditional use permits, that is the special permit and special exception. We've created this unnecessary barrier to investment, whether it be commercial or whether it be housing. And this map shows how many communities, many of them rural without public water and sewer, don't allow multifamily. It shows those that allow it as of right, which is very limited, and the majority that require it via special permit. We need to move away from this. The fact is, we need to do more across all forms of development via site plan and not via special permit. This map is one of the most interesting to me. It's the incentive zone housing program that came out about a decade ago and was being actively pushed with communities. This shows hope for me in the sense that it shows how many communities were either showed an interest, were actually doing the study, or had actually adopted such zones. And as we see here, many of these zones were adopted down in Fairfield County and so forth. It shows hope that there was a lot of interest in this, that communities do want to actually find ways of providing more affordable housing. That being said, when I look at some of these zones that were developed, I recently did some work with the community, excessive parking requirements, the minimum floor areas that I just spoke about, high affordability, all these things become challenging. But the excessive parking requirements, the community I was working in, for example, they required every apartment to have an enclosed garage. That's just unrealistic, adding about $20,000 in cost to each unit. We have to find that balance between access to transportation in the job market and access to other opportunities and to affordable housing. So we need to find a way to balance across communities the amount of affordable housing. Quick considerations, because I want to give you time for some questions. The greatest need is at the lowest incomes. 8-30G is actually not getting at the true affordability need. That's not to say that we don't need more housing in communities that's affordable to 80% AMI or 60% AMI, but the greatest need is at the lowest incomes. One size fits all doesn't work. We need county and local specific strategies. Demand side strategies are probably most effective, that is voucher programs. The fact that we have a lottery to access affordable housing for low-income households, from my perspective, is criminal. But to truly address that deep poverty need for housing, vouchers are the most effective way. And 60% AMI don't address that core need, but they do address the need for affordability across many communities. This is kind of the juxtaposition of employment opportunity versus education opportunity versus access to transportation, and how do we actually find that balance? I'll let you read that on your own. So supply side strategies like low-income tax credits risk the further clustering of poverty within our central cities, as we already do. In the demand side strategies, such as voucher programs, are needed to address the greatest need. They provide the greatest flexibility and opportunity for households to make their own decisions, balancing housing, transportation, employment, and education. But they require funding, a lot of funding, and we have to find a way to be willing to do that. And they also require robust enforcement and fair housing laws. 8-30G is imperfect. The 10% threshold across all communities is not achievable. But this is not a free pass for high-income periphery communities to pass on affordable housing or not provide it. It needs to be adjusted to the potentialities of the community or of the region. The 30% affordable is too high from my perspective, from a financial feasibility perspective. If we reduce that to 20% affordable, we get more 8-30G developments. They'd be more financially feasible. And if we reduce the 60% AMI down to a third or less of the affordable units, not 50% of the affordable units, it would also make them more financially feasible. So those are simple tweaks, I think, that can be made to 8-30G to make it more appealing and more effective. Inclusionary zoning reforms. We need to remove conditional use requirements on multifamily and affordable housing, eliminate minimum unit sizes, or at least let the building code at 400 square feet per unit drive it, allow affordable units on smaller units smaller than market rate, as I emphasized, allow accessory units as of right, reduce excessive parking and design requirements, and encourage affordable housing through a zoning regulation aimed at providing affordable housing. Assess your local market, determine the need, calculate the households by income, units by cost, construction costs, and determine market feasibility, affordability levels, unit mix, and align deed restrictions with 8-30G, and create zoning regs that can actually provide for a financially feasible and developable affordable housing. Explore other options, purchase or lease existing units. As I said, existing units are cheaper and less expensive than current units. Can you lease or buy units in the existing multifamily development to provide as affordable? Provide tax abatements for the conversion or creation of affordable units. Consider waiving permit fees, which can be a substantial cost on the overall development. We've got to start looking outside the box. That's the 3 question marks there. You know, what other opportunities are there to drive down the cost? Thank you. I'm open to taking questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Don, for this very thought-provoking presentation. We'll start the Q&A now. So you can indicate that you want to ask a question by raising your hand in the participant box. I think you can click it on the bottom of your screen and then raise your hand. I'll then call on people and then unmute you, and you have the choice to put your video on if you'd like, and then Don will answer your question. So it looks like the first person to raise their hand is Frank D. Felice. I will unmute you now and you can ask your question.
Hi, Don. Thanks very much. Great presentation. A couple things. First of all, I was under the impression that the minimum unit size was not valid anymore. If it isn't, is that true or is that not true? And if it isn't, certainly I think that it should be eliminated.
Yeah, I don't like playing lawyer, Frank, and thank you for participating today. I'm not sure specifically on the status of that. I think there has been ample case law nationwide kind of undermining those minimums. But at the end of the day, the fact is they still exist in a lot of zoning regulations. It's hard for me to find zoning regs that don't have them. So it still needs to be addressed on the local level, whether it's legal or not.
Thank you.
Yes, I see Rudy has his hand up. I'm unmuting you now.
Thank you, Dr. Pullen. I appreciate your presentation and certainly a wealth of statistics that I would have to read 3 or 4 times again just to digest most of it or a little bit of it. But to your last point, we here locally in Richfield did float the idea of buying existing units. We have 400 to 500 units of condominiums that are close to or below some of the areas or the income levels that you're referring to, or the selling prices. And the associations objected vehemently, and we quickly walked away from it. The Board of Selectmen felt that it was way too controversial. And we did offer a tax credit, at least in the discussions I proposed. So that didn't work for us, and I don't know if you have any suggestions there.
Yeah, so just quickly, one, I give you guys credit for, you know, going down that route and looking at that. Once again, I guess my gut would tell me that you may have a better opportunity on the rental multifamily market than on the, you know, because you're only dealing with one owner versus an association. And
Right.
especially in communities, maybe not Ridgefield, but in communities with older kind of 1970s, 1980s apartments that just are lacking competitiveness in the marketplace overall. I would think that there'd probably be a lot of owners out there that'd be willing to talk about deals to purchase. So it may not be right for every community, but
Right.
kudos to you for considering.
And one of the deterrents, you hit the nail on the head with the cost, because I know many of the developers here feel that it just isn't economically feasible to build affordable housing. Although we did see applications come in during the recession, and when the housing market died, they were looking to, I'm going to make this statement, I may be wrong, but to keep the cash flow going.
Yeah.
And they went the affordable route. But locally here, the deed restriction and the historic districts and what appears to be the wide impact, negative impact that 8-30, at least on the surface, presents when an application comes in to tear down a 1700s house and there's no way to stop that. That has really given 8-30G some of its negative publicity, and I think we need to carve out those historic areas that we're trying to preserve. And some of the legislation, or one of the points being proposed, I believe, is to eliminate the character of a neighborhood relative to an application. And I think we need to do a lot more work with the legislature as part of a regular session to begin either putting a working group together, but to really truly identify why hasn't 8-30G not worked. You looked at it from an economic perspective, but I know that some groups, Desegregate Connecticut, are looking at it for racial diversity, and we haven't seen 8-30G do that, to my knowledge, at least not in my community. So do you have any ideas there? Should we combine affordable education with education and vouchers that, you know, the money follows the student? How would you propose us to come up with a multifaceted approach to solve this problem? Because it involves transportation, as you said. The 10% requirement doesn't make any sense in the woods of our state. So we need to address that. Transportation is one way of addressing it. Education, I think if we're going to really move into the future in the long term, it's got to be a long-term approach, and education is critical to the young people in our cities. That many have said that there's an educational disparity between the cities and the suburbs, and then again, the housing in general.
So let me just, I mean, that's a lot to come up with on the spot, but let me address one thing. And it's always, I kind of look at the idea in the context of policies of outcomes. What is the desired outcome of 8-30G? It's to provide affordable housing. And is it? Yes. Is it doing it to the degree the legislature may have hoped 30 years ago? Probably not. And could it do better? Probably yes. So if the outcome is to get more affordable housing built, then how do we structure that or change that? In the context of 8-30G right now, what do a lot of communities do? They try and produce that amount of units that they reach the numerical calculation so that they can enact the moratorium and have a reprieve from being under the threat of 8-30G, right? It's allowable, it's reasonable, why not? But once again, that's not really producing the numbers we wanted. What if we change, I'm not saying this is the solution, but a hypothetical option. What if we change 8-30G to say, if each community, based on maybe population size, number of households, amount of market demand, if every community in Connecticut could produce somewhere, say, depending on your size, between 3 and 20 affordable housing units per year. Multiply 10 times 169, that's 1,600 units per year, 1,690. And every time you produced, you hit your threshold, you were exempt from 8-30G the following year. That's a huge incentive to you now as Ridgefield or any other community to actually figure out a way to build 10 units per year. And if every community was doing that, we'd actually produce a lot more affordable housing than what we're getting right now. So I think there's other ways of looking at how to structure this to meet the desired outcome, affordable housing. That's what we want. So there's other ways of thinking about it.
Thank you. I'll yield to other questions at this point.
Are there any other participants who would like to ask a question?
If not, I'll have another one. I do.
Sure.
And one of the things we're experiencing, you compared Fairfield County to the rest of the state, and a lot of your examples were in Hartford. One of the things we're experiencing here is the cost of land that's ever escalating. And with that, it's supply and demand. We have a higher demand. Right now, we're going through an incredible demand for housing here as a result of the COVID-19 and people vacating the higher density areas. That creates two problems. The developers aren't going to look at affordable housing now because they can go full market and the demand is there. And number two, the cost of the units, unless we are able to come up with some form of a subsidy for the land cost to bring the cost per unit down, this is going to be very, very difficult.
Yeah, so this is where, at the end of the day, part of the idea of this presentation is to drive thought and to kind of challenge people. And if you feel uncomfortable, that's great, that's fine. But I think we need a broader, more open discussion about the idea of affordability and the factors that play into it. You said land values are high, right? Because that's pure supply and demand. We often don't talk about zoning and land use and comprehensive plans in the context of markets and supply and demand. But if your community is 30 square miles, right? That is your total supply. You as the community can regulate the supply side of the market. How much land do you want to make available for development and at what density and intensity? Now, if you do all 4-acre zoning, then you're only going to get a yield of X. If you do 2-acre zoning, then that yield changes. If you do multifamily, that changes also. So we on the governmental side can actually intervene in the market on the supply side. Now, we can rarely ever control demand other than kind of amenities, quality of government, quality of education, those things. But we have the ability to intervene. So when I say broader discussion, I think we have to recognize that, and I'm not opposed to open space preservation and conservation, but we've got to recognize that open space preservation is in direct opposition to the idea of affordability. If you take 500 acres out of the market for conservation, then you're taking away supply and you're driving up, the value on the remaining land. So once again, let me be clear. I'm not saying no conservation or preservation, but we need to start thinking about how we actually intervene in those markets and the things that we do. And maybe if our goal is high quality, high amounts of preservation lands, then maybe we also have to offset that with greater density in other places. Now that changed the character. I understand where it's coming from. I actually don't necessarily disagree with it or agree with it. The fact is, I think the idea of community character is really important and kind of paramount to planning. It's a problem when it is a euphemism for something else to exclude. But looking at the community, the character of community is important. And I always thought part of the program I showed, the incentive zone housing program, part of its problem was, even though a lot of communities were interested in it, is the densities were unrealistic for Connecticut. wanting 12 units per acre. A lot of our urban cores don't even have 12 units per acre in most of their areas. So we have to be realistic about what is the existing character of the community and what is the density and affordability we can add into it. So things like the accessory apartments, I think, do become key in providing a way of doing that, or allowing smaller multifamily 10, 12, 16 unit developments in appropriate locations. So it's going to take a lot of tools.
Sure. I'll ask you one more question. Sorry. Sure. And that has to do with the special session and the possibility of the zoning modifications at the state level. Do you agree that the state of Connecticut as a legislature should be modifying zoning regulations more of a one-size-fits-all, or should we be forming a working group with both local and state involvement to come up with a solution?
So these are a few of my thoughts, probably broader than you want to hear, but let's go back to 8-30G. I interpret as it was a message sent from the legislature back in the 1980s that said either provide affordable housing or face the consequences, the threat, right? Mm-hmm. And it may not have been the best policy that, for reasons I showed, couldn't produce housing, but now communities have spent basically 30 years under the threat of 8-30G and it's become contentious. That's problematic. That's part of this problem. And for me, it gets back to that idea. The statistician and quality control guru Deming was famous for telling industry, regulate yourself before government comes regulating you. My message to municipalities is solve this affordability yourself before the state starts telling you how you're going to solve it. That's the threat that's facing you right now. Is the state's going to step in and set, through the legislature and legislation, it may set statewide mandates. I don't necessarily think that's the best approach, but I think it's the end result of the fact that we haven't addressed this affordability issue, and therefore we're going to address it through a hammer and, through a stick, not through an incentive. I think the more municipalities can do to actually make affordable housing occur, and not just affordable. I think the more we could make multifamily housing, period, easier to get approved and more accessible, the less the pressure on affordability is going to be there, and the more likely we'll get more affordable housing. Big picture, no. I agree with, and I think a lot of the Desegregate Connecticut proposal is well intended. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure that zoning should be 8-32, 8-2 state legislative mandates. I really, really struggle with that because at the end of the day, I believe in markets. That's what I'm talking about here is how do we function, have land use function within market realities? And I'm not sure it's the best solution, but thanks. I see some hands, Jamie Stevenson and then Frank DeFelice.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Poland. I would like to hear your thoughts on inclusionary zoning regulations. We have that here in Darien. It's been very successful in smaller multifamily housing developments of 5 units or more. We require 12% of those units to be affordable, and it's allowed affordable housing to be integrated throughout our community. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and I'm very curious why that is not a recommendation in the Desegregate Connecticut's proposal.
Yeah, I can't speak to specifically the recommendations coming from Desegregate. I think inclusionary provisions are extremely important. I just recently recommended them to a community as part of their POCD update process. The fact is those economics, when just 10 or 12 or even 15% of the units have to be affordable, and especially if they're at 80% AMI, or you keep at least the 60% AMI at a minimum, the finances become much better and it works much better. I would love to see communities, just across the board, kind of any developments in excess of 10 units, require, 10 or 12 or 15% of the units be affordable. I think we'd get a lot more units built than we currently are. So I think those inclusionary processes, and as I said in one of my final slides there, kind of, figure out what the affordability market is in your community, craft a zoning reg aimed at it, and encourage it. And so long as you did your homework on the market and financial feasibility, I think the developers will gravitate to it. So, thanks.
All right, I see Frank D. Felice has his hand up. I am unmuting you now.
Thank you again. So I imagine, Don, that you've seen the proposed working draft that was put forth by Senator Anwar, I believe it is. And in the review of that, the kind of the assessment that was attached to it, it says that it would enable municipalities to terminate non-housing non-conforming uses, including ones that are still being practiced. I'm not exactly sure that that's what the verbiage in the draft says, but is there any reason you can imagine that we would want to allow a municipality to terminate non-housing, non-conforming uses?
Yeah, I haven't read the draft in full yet. I skimmed it the other night. That jumped out at me as an area. I really want to read that language closely. It kind of shocked me that there was non-conforming language in that bill. I don't think the housing affordability and/or exclusionary and/or racial segregation issues associated with zoning are directly linked to nonconformities, and especially if they're non-housing nonconformities. So I just felt like maybe someone's trying to get a pet project or a pet peeve or something in there that they want. Now, that being said, across the country, it's about a 50-50 split. Most states allow us to amortize nonconformities. So you go to a place like Louisiana and the commission can say, they can change the zone and say on this date, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, all properties have to cease their existing use and be conforming. That is a fairly common practice across the country. It's never been the practice here in Connecticut. We've afforded nonconformities the ability to persist and exist. And I would be very hesitant to supporting a change in that practice unless someone can show me a really good reason as to why.
I think my assessment is the same as yours. It looks as though somebody wants something.
Yeah, so it was an odd piece. It jumped out at me. I was like, what is that? Thanks, Frank.
Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. We have another question from Stephen Meskers. I'm unmuting you now.
Thank you. I just got these signals on mute. It would be, well, one, I want to thank you very much for the presentation. There are two questions. The first one, your estimates on square footage and cost per square footage with reduction in size, it looked like it was linear. And I guess my question is, given that empty space is a lot cheaper than full space in terms of fixtures, appliances, et cetera, was that a rough estimate, or do you expect that that's the kind of decline in pricing?
Yeah, no, I mean, remember, at the end of the day, I'm using that basic kind of from the market research I do in the Hartford market. We kind of have this starting point that's somewhere around $2 a square foot. That's the make or break number. Okay. Now, I have one developer, his numbers himself, he's down at 185 a square foot that he's figured out how to make these things work. I have other developers that their numbers are up at, 230 a square foot. So I was using that as a basic kind of just plus or minus, a way to look at, could this work or could this not work? Each development needs to pencil out. And you're right, on smaller units, smaller developments, the cost per square foot are probably going to push higher. Those returns aren't going to be the same. So it has to be worked out development by development. In the context of the hypothetical 400 unit apartments I put out there, I think it was a pretty solid number, and those numbers would translate well with those square footages, but not on a 40 unit development. So.
Okay, and just as a common observation, I guess changing the regulations to in the 830G to make 830G more effective. I would be concerned at this point that would without a transitional period, without input from the planning and zoning commissions of the various towns, you probably would incite, because ultimately we're at the same point with it's a bigger stick and it's less home rule.
Yeah.
So, you know, what I've seen with, you know, at the legislative side, you know, I've only been there for one session. I've seen how we've moved forward with harbor management plans, shellfish commissions, et cetera, where the state exercises its authority, but then instructs the towns to develop their policies. So I would suggest a more aggressive 830G. There would need to be a transitional period where planning and zoning would need to understand what the goals and targets, where they can make the shoe fit before we change that rule and just impose, because the comments I get on 830G right now is just that this, both on suitability, you know, and it's that carrot and stick, it's a suitability, what's going on at the local level, how does the state intervene? So enhancing 830G before we do a transitional. And I loved your comment about looking to set goals and targets, you know, to let every town figure out how they can get to their goal is probably where you find better and more robust support. Because I think just saying we're going to make 830 more attractive to the developers is probably not where I would think a majority of the legislature wants to go.
Yeah, I mean, I get that. I don't disagree with you. You know, my recommendations would be more in the area of how do we figure out local strategies that are actionable and actually achieve the desired outcome. That being said, I also wanted to drive home the point that, you know, it's the 30% of affordable units that are kind of undermining the economics, financial feasibility of the development. If you could lower those numbers down, then I think the developments would become more financially feasible. It's not necessarily, it was to show kind of, there's an alternative way to think about 8-30G. It's not necessarily my recommendation that we do that. 8-30G is imperfect, and I think maybe an alternative is probably easier than a fix based on how controversial it's become. So I want to find a way to get towards solutions, whatever those are. You know, I'm open to any path.
All right, thanks.
Yep. Love your background, by the way. So.
All right, I don't see any other questions. Would Rudy or Francis like to make any concluding remarks?
Sure, thanks, Kristen. Thank you, Dr. Bowen, for a very interesting presentation. We have recorded this and we'll be sharing it. We'll also be circulating Dr. Poland's slide deck for those who are interested. And we're happy to announce that Dr. Poland will be back to present this again for anybody who may have missed it at our August 6th planners lunch. Information on that is on our website.
Great. If I could just thank you guys, I really appreciate this opportunity. I look forward to returning. And at the end of the day, I just want to contribute to the greater discussion here. And I'm open to any alternatives, not necessarily a specific agenda. So look forward to speaking with all of you in the future.
Thank you.